Okay, hey guys, this is Mike with TimeMojo.com, and today we have a video review of a friend of mine named David, who gave me some footage of himself playing 1-2-6 max zoom on PokerStars. Alright, so this first hand, we get 8-6 suited on the button. And just a little background before I start this hand, just so you know, the regs at this stake are thinking on a bit of a higher level than the previous stake. So when you are seeing a reg make an action, you kind of need to put yourself in his shoes in order to make the best judgment call. So you'll see what I mean in this hand, and this is why I chose this hand to go first. So we steal 8-6 suited on the button and get 3-bet, and there's a cold caller here who kind of quickly calls, which is kind of interesting because I think he has a pretty straight up range here of something like 10s, jacks, and like ace queen plus, and since they're deep, he could even have like queens. So David decides to call, and we flop top pair, which is good. And then this guy who looks to be like a reg decides to lead. And if you think about what I just said, his range here, if it's something like ace queen, ace king, this is a really good spot to lead into us because we're a relatively unknown to him. As you can see, I mean, we have no hands on these guys, and David does not play these stakes. So this is just, they have no idea who we are. So this is a really good play. Of course, we ended up calling because we have top pair, and the reg checks to us. And David does something really cool here, which I really like. He eventually decides to bet 28 here, and he's doing this because he's really confident that this guy has the ace queen plus type range here, and he's just trying to induce some kind of like spaz or call to get a little extra value out of that range, who thinks maybe we have the same kind of hand as him. So the reg does call. And then once he does, you could toy with another really small bet here, but I think it's probably, you've probably gotten the max value out of his, the range we want here. So David eventually checks back, and the villain shows ace queen. So this was just a amazingly well played hand by David. And if you, as long as you're thinking about what your opponents are capable of and their range, you can make really cool plays like this. So if you're kind of just clicking random bet sizes when you get post flop and looking at your hand, you're really missing out on a lot of value like this. Okay, this next hand is kind of a common spot that you'll see across all stakes and all games. And as I've said in my other videos, we prove that players who take longer to raise pre-flop fold to more 3-bets. So when you have a hand in position like 10 jack here and someone takes a while to raise in front of you, especially on the hijack, this is a really good spot for a 3-bet bluff. And one of the reasons I like 10 jack here so much is it blocks the, if he decides to call, it blocks the range that we don't want him to have. So the kind of hands we want him to have here are like an ace queen type hand rather than a hand like 10s and jacks. So because in position we can beat ace king quite often. So anyway, as played, David 3-bets, which is awesome, and the reg mucks. So keep an eye out for this spot. It's very profitable. All right, so this next hand we open king jack offsuit on the button and get called by the big blind. And we flop a gut shot, which is nice, and we c-bet and get check raised. And David does something kind of interesting here. He decides to call this with his gut shot equity, mainly because he's planning on floating this turn, because he thinks that the reg is really likely to just be doing this once with just like a weak hand trying to get us to fold. But it's really hard for him to continue once we call. And that is especially true given this turn. This turn completes the obvious straight on the board, so once we call this flop, the chance of us folding on this turn is really low. So I would expect the reg to check fold all of his bluffs here and probably check call all of his strong hands. So David bets 28, which I think is fine. And the reg check calls, which sucks because once he check calls that turn, it's really unlikely for him to fold because now it really does look like he has a queen and a pretty strong one. So that being said, I think the best thing to do for David here is to just check back because it's really hard to make a reg fold a strong queen here, especially if we're fairly unknown. So David kind of time banks because he's thinking about making a move, but he knows it's wrong, and the guy shows king queen. So I think it was well played by David. It's unfortunate it didn't work, but not all plus EV plays work. This next hand, we get pocket fours on the button and call a what looks to be like a raise preflop, and the big blind comes along. So the first thing I want to point out is the big blind took less than a second to check. Whenever you see that, they almost always are going to fold to a bet because they have the check fold button on. So that being said, this is really like a heads up pot now. So, and not to mention, this reg just kind of snaps c-bets half pot on this board, which just always means exactly what it looks like. He just has an ace. So David thinks he has a gut shot here, and he thinks he can push him off this ace with enough pressure. So David decides to raise, which I think is really cool. And this guy snap folds, no surprise. And the reg calls, and we bank the best card in the deck, which is awesome. I know it kind of like changes our plan, but David would have continued on a lot of turns depending on what they were. Obviously, something like an ace he wouldn't have, and probably not like a 3. But obviously on this turn, we're doing it for value. So David's going to bet pretty big, which I think is really good, just perfect. And reg snap check calls, which is no surprise because he's very likely to have an ace. So David does something really interesting here, which I don't know if I like it or not. He decides to jam instead of just making a normal value bet. And I know why he's doing it. He's doing it because his logic is if he's going to call a bet of like 75 here, he should be calling any bet because he's repping like the same range with a bet. So that being said, though, the fact that we are an unknown to this person, I think makes it much less likely for him to call. So I actually prefer just a kind of easy to call bet here of like 71 or so. And the reg ends up folding. He may not have called the smaller bet, but just kind of an interesting hand. Alright, this will be our last hand. David opens up threes on the button, and we get called by what looks to be a fishy type player. He has a awkward stack and so far some pretty fishy stats. And David c-bets this board, which I think is fine. Definitely can't really check back. Turn doesn't really change much. He's very unlikely to have a 4. And if he's calling this board, he does have a few draws in his hand, but it's really just flush draws. There's not really very many other type of draws in there, like I guess a light gut shot. So I don't think it's a good bet, especially when the board pairs against a fish, because if he does have a pair like 5s, 6s, and 7s, he'll never fold it, and he's definitely not going to fold an 8 because he has 2 pair now. So I think I would always bet a strong 8 here, or 9s through queens, and obviously a king, but not this hand. So David checks back, and the guy just kind of like instant checks the river, like really fast. And the way his behavior has been, he's just kind of quickly trying to get to the river and showdown, means I definitely don't think he has a hand at all. He could have some really weak pair after calling this flop, like maybe some weak 8 or a hand like pocket sixes, something like that. But David doesn't think he has the best hand enough, and I kind of agree with that. So David does something really interesting here, which is fairly unconventional, but is a really cool move against a fishier player. He decides to way overbet here. He bets 44 into 19. And I think this would absolutely make a fishy player fold an 8 and maybe even a king. And just with how quickly he's trying to finish this hand, I think he's just always going to fold to this, and because it's just like this guy only has 86 bucks left, and it's probably once the stack is gone, he's going to quit. So I think he'd probably wait for a better spot to lose his money. So I think this is really profitable, and it pushes out that lower middle end of his range that might call a bet of like 14, but would never call a bet like this. So fish folds, we win, good hand. And that's the video. So thank you, David, for providing me with this footage. It was really exciting. I hope you guys learned something. As always, if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask me in the comments section. Thanks for watching, guys.